Welcome back everyone to China in Hearts of Iron 4. Now, with Waking the Tiger about to come out, I decided to actually make a video explaining what the fuck's going on with all these little tiny countries, aka the Chinese warlords. And yeah, because I feel like Paradox didn't really do that much of a good job at explaining what the fuck's going on. There's all these weird countries that nobody knows what what are doing there, and so yeah, there's no explanation in the game. Anyway, these are the warlords, of course. China's mostly divided up, and you have just China proper, China, that is the Nanjing government, the government of the Nationalist Party over here, the Kuomintang, and Jiang Jieshi, or Chiang Kai-shek. And that's, you know, the central government of China that you're supposed to be playing as if you're playing as China. Then you have a bunch of different warlords scattered throughout this countryside, and, well, they've been there for a while, because this situation originates around 1911 with the fall of the Qing dynasty, the last empire of China. You know, famous movie, The Last Emperor and all of that. The boy Emperor Pui gets deposed, and then, yeah, you all know the story. Anyway, after that, there was a problem, because a lot of the different provincial military leaders, with the way the Qing dynasty worked was that there was a very, very high amount of delegation in terms of the military to different provinces. It was a feudal empire. So, of course, all the provincial military leaders, once they saw that the dynasty was going down, they switched sides to the revolutionaries, to the Republican Nationalist revolutionaries. However, they did so without really sharing the nationalist ideology, which back then wasn't spearheaded by Jiang Jieshi. This guy was actually led by Sun Yat-sen, or Sun Zhongshan, who is right now considered as probably the main father of the modern China. After this sort of big switch off, there was a whole bunch of different events and all of that. No reason to explain that all. It's just very, very complicated. But you have this fragmentation of power from the sort of central government, which was based in Beijing, all to the provinces. And the provinces are culturally, especially the more farther ones, such as Guangdong down here, and you know, Fujian, this one, Zhejiang, all of these, especially the southern ones, but also the sort of central inland ones, such as Gansu and Qinghai, these two ones. They're very, very culturally distinct from the sort of North Chinese main population. The languages are much different, the cultures had different stages of development, and so it was pretty easy for these provincial warlords to set themselves up and to use this kind of regional rhetoric also to strengthen their power base. Another thing which sort of helped them was how politics in China used to work. Again, as I said, the army was more of a provincial... these armies were independent provincial organizations that were mostly there for public order rather than to actually, you know, fight in war. And so these local rulers already had an established system to work from, and so they could do that. And another thing that sort of helped them out was, of course, the sort of feudal, personal relationship-based kind of politics. And in China, that is also still very important today. It's just a very, very... it's a country that's culturally very focused on the personal relationship as a power structure, the guanxi, the relationship. And so, of course, you have that. Now, fast forwarding over to 1936, about 25 years after the revolution that overthrew the Qing dynasty, and you have the Nationalist Party in control. Nationalist Party under Jiang Jieshi, who used to be, back in the days of the first Republican government, used to be the chief of the army and the chief of the main military academy, the Huangpo military academy that trained up most of the leaders for the Chinese Nationalist Army. So because of this, the leaders who are commanding the Nationalist Army are mostly people who were trained by Jiang Jieshi. So he has a sort of personal connection to these leaders, and they owe them personal allegiance rather than to the state. So of course, it's all fine and dandy for when these guys don't want to rebel against the central government, but when they do, they don't have a sort of allegiance to the central state that is preventing them from doing so. So that's why also you have so many different warlords all throughout. Because most of these guys, they don't really feel any loyalty to an ideology or to China as a state. They mostly feel loyalty to themselves, and sometimes they play off of either ideological or regional reasons for their control on power. And I'll explain a little bit more as we go along. So these guys in the provinces don't actually take orders from the center, but one thing that's actually kind of different in Hearts of Iron to real life is that all throughout these different warlords, well, I mean, some of these do, they actually fly the nationalist flag, because technically this is all part of the Republic of China, except for Manchukuo, which has been, of course, taken by Japan, and Manchukuo, but these two are legally part of China anyway during this time period. Like, Manchukuo was considered a rogue state. It wasn't internationally recognized, not even by Germany and Italy. Later on, with the formation of the Tripartite Pact and the Axis, Germany and Italy actually recognized Manchukuo, but before that, basically nobody but Japan recognized Manchukuo and Manchukuo. Now, Manchukuo is a separatist state that is supposed to be of the Manchu or Jurchen ethnic sort of group, who are the original inhabitants of Manchuria. But by this point, Manchuria was mostly colonized by Chinese. So the population in these areas is, well, a majority ethnically Chinese, especially from the northern Chinese regions. And Manchukuo, on the other hand, is a Mongolian ethnically based state. Mengu is the way in Chinese you say Mongolia. So Manchukuo, or Manchukuo in Japanese, is the Mongolian state. And this is set up in the sort of Inner Mongolia area, Neimenguo, which is still today one of the provinces of China, which is this belt, as opposed to Outer Mongolia, which is this one, of course, right now a puppet state of the Soviet Union. So these two are, right now under Japanese influence, but even before the establishment of Manchukuo in 1933, there was a warlord state over here, the Fengtian clique, because these warlords were not just singular warlords. Sometimes they formed cliques that were sort of conglomerates of several warlords, alliances of several warlords, if you may. So there's the most important ones were the Fengtian clique, right here in Manchuria, under the Zhang family of warlords, who eventually got replaced by the Japanese. And in fact, Zhang Suiliang, the last warlords of this area, is actually right now a general in Nationalist China, although I don't think... No, you don't have him as a field marshal, but yeah, he's supposed to be a field marshal for you, and he's actually going to be the one to instigate the Yan'an incident, but that's for later. And yeah, so those guys initially were under Japanese influence. They let Japan build up a massive sort of industrial empire in Manchuria, which made Manchuria one of the most advanced economically regions in China, and so they made it, in a way, even more of a prized possession, and using a lot of internal weaknesses, the Japanese were able to eventually just seize control of it. Then they used separatist Mongolian movements to sort of destabilize the Mongolia area. And the other ones, the other independent states that are in the legal territory of China, are usually all warlords. The other main clique of warlords is the Guanxi clique, although it has actually some pretty nasty internal divisions. Oh, sorry. I just made my microphone fall. Probably was pretty bad. Anyway, I'll tag over to the Guanxi clique. I'm not sure if it's actually represented right now, but it probably will be in Waking the Tiger. This is, by the way, the normal version of the game. You actually don't have your own commanders. See, I thought that the different generals available to the Guanxi clique would reflect the different warlords that are inside the country, but I guess not. Anyway, the main Guanxi clique general is Li Zonren, and yeah, Guanxi is just the region, this one. Now, there's also supposed to be a clique over here, the Sichuan, and the Sichuan Xikang cliques, which was actually one of the most fragmented ones, so it would be difficult to represent, because it would be like 5 or 6 different warlords that divide this area between themselves. So it would be difficult to represent, and that's why I think that's why Paradox does not put them in the game. Going back to China, then you have the Shaanxi, the Xibei Sanma, which also known as the Ma clique, and oh well, here you see the Ma clique, and then you have Xinjiang. Now these 3 are interesting. Now the Xibei Sanma just mean this weird name just means Northwest Free Ma's. Okay, the Ma's are the ruling family of this clique. Like, you know, Ma Bufang is represented as the leader, and actually all of the Ma's, because there were a lot of Ma's around here, it was a family business, I guess you could say. All of them were kind of independent of each other, but most of them owed allegiance to the central government. They were very independent, but they mostly followed orders from Nanjing. So these, actually, it would be, in a way, a little bit more realistic to represent them as a puppet of nationalist China, because these guys, more than the others, were collaborating with the Nanjing authorities. Now, I wonder if it's this one? Okay. The reason that their flag in Hearts of Iron 4 has this little crescent and moon thing is because this area is inhabited, Gansu, Qinghai, and Ningxia. They're actually inhabited by Muslims. So this clique is actually made up of Muslims, and that's why that they have a Ma surname, because that's supposed to be Muhammad. So it's actually a very common surname among Muslims. And yeah, their armies usually were composed of ethnic Muslims who are also known, well, I know that doesn't make any sense, but Chinese who converted to Islam, their name, usually you refer to them as Hui. And they are religiously Muslims, but ethnically they're pretty close to the other sort of Chinese of this area. And what's not represented, though, is that there was a sort of conflict going on between Ma warlord, you know, Muslim, ethnically Muslim troops, and the government of Xinjiang. That is because, let's tag over to Xinjiang. Oh, God damn it. Of course, Paradox sometimes uses the Wade Giles spelling of Xinjiang. Sometimes they use pinyin like Xibei Sanma, so it's very, very complicated and confusing. Anyway, Xinjiang up here is kind of an oddball out, because there was a conflict going on between Ma's and this guy, Shen Shitai, and we'll get to him later. Of course, without going too in-depth, because otherwise it would be just an hour long or something. Anyway, let's go to the last warlord of mainland China, Shaanxi. Shaanxi, of course, Shaanxi Province, which is this one, relatively poor at the start of the 20th century, and this is kind of represented, but as you can see, it does have some industry. That is because the guy in charge, Yan Xishan, was actually a relatively effective governor. He played off of not only regional aspirations for Shaanxi, but also kind of an ideology that he composed himself, a kind of economic system that was supposed to be a sort of fusion of the best parts of various different ideologies that were around. And it's kind of interesting. You can read up more of it. He even was kind of a philosopher, even though that never had like a big impact. So he never really made political plays for power or something like that. He was mostly, again, a self-serving warlord, but he did have some nuances and some interesting parts of his system that you know, he tried to build up as a sort of national ideology, or regional ideology, I guess you could say. And so he's the one that governs in Shaanxi. He's actually supposed to control Beijing and Tianjin as well. Although, actually, no, he used to, considering in from the late 1920s over to 1935-ish, this area was under the control of Shaanxi. But then the Japanese came in and they set up the East Hebei Council, and then the Chahar Political Council, this one, and then the Hebei Political Council. It was just a very, very big mess. And at some point, essentially this area was kind of a contested zone between Japan, Shaanxi, and in a way the KMT troops from Nanjing. So this area, I guess, would make more sense as a Shaanxi state, but whatever. Anyway, other than that, they controlled Taiyuan, this city over here, kind of a provincial little city. And during this period, they were able to, again, kind of develop it, both industrially and sort of in terms of infrastructure. So it was kind of one of the only areas in China, except for Manchuria and Shanghai, the Shanghai region, and also, in a way, the Guangzhou area down here, you know, modern-day Canton. Well, it used to be called Canton in English. It was one of the only areas in Japan, or in China, that actually had some industrial type of economy. Then you, of course, have, well, right now it's called the PRC, but it's going to be called Communist China. These, of course, are the communists under the control of Mao. Not really a warlord, although they did have sometimes warlords switch to their side. Yeah, because in the sort of personal politics of the warlords, you have sometimes them playing off of the conflict between the KMT in Nanjing and the, you know, CCP, the Communist Party of China. And yeah, they sometimes switched sides to one or the other. Mostly they were allied to the Nationalists, but sometimes they helped out the Communists. And yeah, initially the Communist movement started off down here in southern China, especially in Jiangxi, this one, and also in Guangdong. Not in Guangdong, sorry. Well, yes, part of it in Guangdong and part of it in the area of Guangzhou. It was mostly focused around this part, again, of China. Eventually, they had to retreat for the long march, blah, blah, blah. Bunch of history. No, nobody cares. Then you have Yunnan. And Yunnan is actually the oldest of the cliques, in a way. And they started off as a clique right after the proclamation of the Republic of China, because at one point, China was taken over by one of the main generals of the Manchu dynasty, you know, the Qing dynasty, Yuan Shikai. He tried to proclaim himself emperor, and in Yunnan was actually one of the first sort of regions of China where one of these generals started to resist the central authority in actual support of a republican form of government, so in support of the sort of national revolution. And Yunnan, at the time, was very, very much one of the driving forces behind the sort of revolutionary push. Of course, at this point, Yunnan is kind of just its own little thing. At one point, even the warlord of Yunnan, Tang Jiyao, tried to essentially establish himself as the leader of the KMT. He failed, and so at this point in its history, Yunnan is kind of it's kind of a shadow of its former self, and yeah, it's basically just aligned with the Nanjing government and doing its own thing. The Guanxi clique, on the other hand, has much worse relations with Nanjing, and so there's actually supposed to be a war between China and the Guanxi clique in 1936. And yeah, so in terms of relations to China, Yunnan are pretty good. The Xibei Sanma are pretty good. Shaanxi are These, you know, the warlord of Shaanxi, Yan Shishan, actually fought with Chiang Kai-shek to prevent his unification of China under his rule. And he used a sort of faction within the Kuomintang to try to fight the central authorities. So that's sort of his strategy. But at this point, he's mostly subdued. The Guanxi clique is really the only one that's able to put up much of a resistance because they control some very, very rich lands down here. And the other one that's fighting with the central government is Xinjiang. Now, I can't seem to find a tag for Xinjiang, but yeah, let's go back to him. The reason he's fighting the central government is that there was, as I said, a war between the sort of Hui Muslim forces and Xinjiang, but that was actually a freeway war. It was not just a war between the Ma clique and the Xinjiang authorities under Shaanxi. There was also a separatist movement in this sort of region, Turkestan, to establish a sort of independent republic over here of the Uyghur ethnicity. So these are Chinese Muslims. They're ethnically Chinese. But this area, Xinjiang, is actually inhabited by Uyghur, ethnically Uyghur, which is another ethnicity, peoples. So it's not just the Chinese troops of Xinjiang. These guys would be Chinese. And it's not just the Muslim Chinese troops of Sanma, who are, again, the agents of the central government. There was also another separatist army over here. To sort of solidify his authority, this guy, Shaanxi, decided to essentially request the help of the Soviet Union. And that's why he's represented as a communist, even though Shaanxi wasn't a communist. And Xinjiang was not, was not following a Soviet model in terms of economics and politics. But by basically every definition of the word, Xinjiang was a Soviet colony. That is partially because Xinjiang used Soviet support, but also, funnily enough, they hired white Russian mercenaries to be with their armies. That's actually not represented. But at this point, to represent this historically, there would have to be like a white Russian division in their army. So that's one of the things that I hope that they put in. So you actually had the Soviets, the white Russians, and these sort of troops that are loyal to Shaanxi fighting with the Xibei Sanma troops and with the East Turkestan separatists, the first East Turkestan Republic. So to represent this more accurately, the Xibei Sanma would have to be various different rulers. Of course, Sanma means free Ma's, so the main free Ma's at least could be represented. And then Xinjiang wouldn't control all of this. They would control much less territory. They would have support from Russian units, and it would just be a mess. It would just be such a mess. And then, of course, you have Tibet, but Tibet is an independent, well, an attempt at an independent state. Again, by law, technically, this was all claimed as part of China. So, yeah, these guys really aren't a warlord per se, because it's, again, an attempt at a separation from China. So it's actually a separatist rather than a regionalist or warlord type of state. And that's about it. If any of you are more interested in any of these sort of warlords being covered more extensively, I can make videos on the single warlords. But for now, just to run it short, even though it's probably like already 20 minutes or something. Yeah, 23 minutes. Anyway, to run it not that long, I'll stop it right here. And yeah, I want to thank you all for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this little breakdown of different warlords and why they're there. And I'll see you soon.